Welcome to the Fully Human Psychology podcast with Doctors Sophie and Dr. Chris, where we explore what it means to be and to become fully human. I am Dr. Sophie Archibald, and first, I should add that the opinions that we share on this podcast are our own and not those of any organizations. Also, we would like to remind you that you can follow us on Apple Podcast, YouTube, and Spotify, where you can leave comments and your opinions.
In today's episode, we have the privilege to talk to Dr. Nisha Gupta. Dr. Gupta is an associate professor of psychology at the University of West Georgia, home to a psychology program founded in the 1960s by Abraham Maslow's student, Mike Ahrens. For over 50 years, UWG has been an international hub for humanistic, transpersonal, and critical psychologies. Dr. Gupta teaches courses in existential phenomenology, arts-based research and therapy, and the psychology of creativity. Her research ruptures taboos around marginalized lived experiences, including sexual and gender oppression, creative madness, and spiritual emergencies. She is also a private practice psychotherapist in Georgia, integrating depth and liberation psychologies with a focus on active imagination for trauma healing. Her work as an educator, artist, and therapist seeks to help people heal from personal and societal trauma, cultivate empathy and compassion across differences, and embrace their creative consciousness as a force for personal and collective transformation. She is 2025 recipient of APA Division 5's Distinguished Early Career Award in Qualitative Inquiry, recognized for advancing arts-based phenomenological research as a method for building the psychological humanities. Thank you, Nisha, for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be in conversation with both of you.
I know we tend to like to start with the same question. We definitely have specific questions for you too, based on your work. And I know we're going to kind of free associate some and see where we go. But can you maybe associate some on what the idea of being and becoming fully human means to you, if anything, or where you kind of go with that?
Yeah, first of all, just thank you for that question. It's a really extraordinary question to ask people. And at this time in history, of course, my initial response would be that what it means to be fully human is to be hot messes. But I thought that you might want a more philosophical or hopeful answer. And so I reflected on the question for a while. And a story just kept returning to my mind. And it's a story that's often shared among Zen Buddhist circles. It's the parable of the Chinese farmer. Have either of you heard it before?
I think so.
Oh, I don't think I have. I'm not sure.
So do you mind if I read you a little story to get us started?
Please do.
Okay. All right, here's the parable of the Chinese farmer. And it came to me as a gift from a colleague at a time where something was happening in my life that was just rupturing my life and what I expected it to be. So here we go. Once upon a time, there was a Chinese farmer whose horse ran away. That evening, all of his neighbors came around to commiserate. They said, "We are so sorry to hear your horse has run away. This is most unfortunate." The farmer said, "Maybe." The next day, the horse came back, bringing 7 wild horses with it. And in the evening, everybody came back and said, "Oh, isn't that lucky? What a great turn of events. You now have 8 horses." The farmer again said, "Maybe." The following day, his son tried to break one of the horses, and while riding it, he was thrown and broke his leg. The neighbors then said, "Oh dear, that's too bad." And the farmer responded, "Maybe." The next day, the conscription officers from the government came around to draft people into the army, and they rejected his son because he had a broken leg. Again, all the neighbors came around and said, "Isn't that great?" Again, the farmer said, "Maybe." So this story has been told by Alan Watts too. He's kind of made it famous. And I think it gets to the heart of what it means to be fully and experientially human, which is to hold deep curiosity towards the unfolding possibilities of our lives. And so I think that humans at our heart are temporal creatures. We're embedded in a flow of time, the past, present, and future, which many of us experience as a linear flow of time. Of course, mystics and physicists have been arguing against that, but many of us do. Our consciousness experiences time as linear. The past has passed, we know it well. The present is in front of us, we also know it, but the future is ahead of us. And we don't know it. And so how do we orient to that? And this was, I'll bring in some scholarly stuff here. You know, this was Heidegger's whole argument in Being and Time, that humans, what it means to be in the world, means to be oriented towards a future and its unfolding possibilities. But I think this is then what the question becomes for psychologists, like how do we best orient to the future? This great mystery of the unknown. And I have a bunch of ideas of what I've experienced that I'm curious to pause here and see what is coming up for you with that parable.
Yeah. Wow. Sophie, do you want to reply first? You want me to?
Yeah, I did hear this before, and it has reminded me so many times in my life where I assumed, um, like, uh, so many of the people who came to see the farmer and said to him, assuming that the outcome, the circumstances meant something positive or meant something negative. And and so many times I got caught realizing that there was always piece of what I was experiencing that wasn't what I was expecting. And every time um, there was so many different facets that I could not foresee. And over time, catching these wrong assumptions or perceptions, then I realized, wait a minute, maybe there's just so many things I can't predict, and it might not be what I'm thinking that it is. And remembering that over the course of my life, then I realized, wait a minute, maybe I did catch myself realizing, actually, I'm not so sure if that's what is going to happen from that. So um, it's a beautiful reminder of the many times where my assumptions were so wrong in a in in a good way, but even when the outcome maybe were less pleasant than what I thought, something unfolded after that. So that's what came up to me, is a remembering of all the many times that I came awake to realizing my assumptions were wrong.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm struck by that maybe from the story, and I do think I'd heard that story, but kind of hit me harder this time. The pressure sometimes to know quickly and decisively, which I know has its place, but in your, something Sophie and I both read and reread and talked about some was your piece, integrating spiritual emergency through visionary art therapy, a Jungian autoethnography of psychospiritual trauma healing to benefit the collective. Um, there was a line in here where you basically mentioned, if someone who may possibly be going through a spiritual emergency is too quickly um, diagnosed with a Western model, a pathology of some kind, um, it could really interrupt this process. So I'm just struck by in the story when that you shared, this thing happens and we have quick answers, and then there's this kind of, oh, wait, let's be in the unknowing for a moment. Um, how powerful that can be sometimes, even if it's just a moment. That's one thing that I'm struck by with that. So maybe an aspect of being human is being willing to not know right away.
Yeah, and that's so hard.
Right.
And I appreciate, thank you for bringing up parts of my work. If we look at it culturally, we do live in like the West in a society that puts a lot of focus on knowledge, knowing, control, agency.
Mhm.
We really here believe that humans have free will,
Mm,
that we can shape our lives to our desires and goals and plans. And I think for me also that parable coming from the East is an Eastern perspective of our future, like how to relate to a future that we don't have control over. That is an unfolding mystery. So I think this really brings up this kind of idea for me of also like fate versus free will. How much do we have to let go of control of shaping our lives to
mhm,
our desired outcomes? And
mm,
more surrender and trust the process. Where does agency come in? Because also I'm a big believer of creativity, which is all about agency and human will.
right,
Uh,
right.
and I think, I'm aware I'm speaking to existential psychologists, and so I am just so curious as to when we think about what it means to be human, like how do we humans grapple with the unknown future? Because that unknown causes a lot of anxiety for me. At my best, I think at
Mm,
humans' best, we can kind of be in flow state, co-creating with life. Um,
mm.
but oftentimes, so much pain and suffering are because of the anxiety of the unknown.
Yeah.
I
Mm,
I did sense that from uh, this article that Chris was referring to. Um, you wrote about this the skill to live with this unknown, but then taking responsibility and create while being in relationship with this unknown and not having control. Um,
mm,
I've one of the themes that I highlighted from that piece you wrote is around synchronicity. Um, you talk about that, and to me, there seems to be a little bit of um, the two concepts you're highlighting now, um, creativity and um, the wisdom of letting go and not having control, that within this experience of synchronicity there seems to be both of them there. So it links that concept for me of being able to recognize the synchronicity, and it feels like we might be talking a little bit about that too. um,
mm,
how what is synchronicity in the context of being fully human, and this control and creating at the same time.
mm,
Yeah, I'm thinking about so the paper about my own experience of a spiritual emergency and how spiritual emergencies can, like lead to a shift of consciousness. But once they're, the it's been interesting also to just experience myself as just like a human in the world that went through this thing. And yes, there's some shift in consciousness, but also I'm just like an anxious human moving through the world. But the
Mm.
thing the thing that has shifted is this, as you were talking about, Sophie, I know I'm not alone. My faith in something higher than me that is a benevolent force, whether it's the universe, whether it's God, whether it's my own divine creativity, there's some energy that's bigger than me that I'm in collaboration with. Um, and Jungians would call it like an inner companion, which is the psyche.
Mm.
Um, and that is always the foundation of my consciousness now. It's always can become the thing to come back to.
Mm.
Is that there is a divine companion, and oftentimes that companion has deeper wisdom than myself. I mean, I can tap into that companion through my intuition or through art,
Mm.
but I also am like a human with an ego and with my, little insecurities and anxieties and neuroses. But this other energy is always in dialogue with me if I acknowledge it and hear it. And one way is through synchronicities, yeah. And another like art making, yeah. Well,
Mm.
thank you for that
Mm.
reminder, Sophie. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking about that parable more now in terms of, okay, so if we think of the parable as being within one person's inner world, so each character, and if we assume that the farmer is some shade of wisdom or something, then from an existential standpoint, it strikes me as there's ground in the groundlessness in terms of, like, as you were reading, I did think of how grounded, so to speak, you kind of being able to access that maybe in those contexts, how much groundedness there is, even though there's the maybe of the unknown. So kind of ground in the groundlessness, and kind of and I forget exactly how the parable started, but in terms of, I know a horse got loose, or so that means the horse may have been contained to some degree initially, which is some degree of preparing for contingencies is involved if you're containing the horse. But so, um, and I know in this piece, one thing I think there's so much here, and it's very rich and sacred material. So it's kind of um, I feel a certain amount of intimidation talking about it because it is, yeah. But there's a part where I think early on in the stage of this crisis, there's an emphasis on kind of containment, or kind of the compulsive art making. Um, but you're still working with the crisis. There's a dialogue with it. So I'm not trying to just eliminate the crisis. But there is an act of containment. So that's, you know, so I guess if I can formulate this into a question that I have, then I know one of my questions for you was, and I think probably we'll be able to have your artwork kind of pop up on the screen so people could see it, so I don't have to like hold it up to the camera or anything. But you created this tarot deck out of this crisis, and one thing that I was struck by was, I'm going to read the question here really briefly. Um, okay, so the 6 stages of spiritual evolution that can occur during a dark night of the soul. It struck me that the first 4 stages seemed to me to be very heavily pathologized in mainstream society. And then the last two, um, we may kind of sit a little easier. but then I'm really struck by how can you have the last two without the first four? And I guess a question I have for you is something around that, or if you could talk a little bit about that. And then I also have questions about shadow work and if you see any opportunities for us as a society, a U.S. society around shadow work. But anyway, not exactly a clear question, but do you go anywhere with that?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes up for me, and it is interesting to root a lot of this in culture,
Yeah.
because we are all also here in the West living in a culture, that really puts emphasis on rationality, reason, what, certain parameters of what sanity is supposed to mean, and also linearity. Meaning, like, I think that
Mm,
contemporary mainstream culture suggests that what it means to live a human life is to, like, keep building a life in a linear way to some milestones of success. Um, And that really doesn't account for any possibilities of a death and rebirth process in a human existence. And
mm,
inevitability, like I always, say to my students or like when I'm giving a public talk, like everybody is entitled to at least two nervous breakdowns in our lifetime, at least, it is really bizarre that we don't account for, the nervous break, just times where you break down because of suffering and then kind of re-emerge as a phoenix rising. That the fact that there aren't like rituals in our
mm,
culture to expect for that without pathologizing it in a medical model way and understanding it as a part of human existence,
mm,
like nature's cycles. I guess, yeah, as somebody who was born and raised Hindu, we like India really accounts for death and rebirth, right? That's just like built in. And then we
mm,
have the goddess Kali, who is in one of my tarot cards. It's the Tower card,
mm,
it was all about destroying what needs to be destroyed so new
mm,
life, new possibilities can emerge. So the creative destruction and rebirth process. And so I think
mm,
that like spiritual emergency, right, is possibly a way of reclaiming that natural breakdown of consciousness that's inevitable in a human existence that's lived authentically,
mm,
for new insights, new ways of being to emerge. And it
mm.
is, I think the medical model has done a disservice to honoring that process.
Yes. Yeah.
There, there is so much of what you're saying that resonates with um, the work of being a psychotherapist when we are asked. I remember being asked so many times, the when will I know that I'm doing better and that, we can discharge from from clinical work and having to, to talk a little bit about what thriving means and that thriving doesn't mean that we feel good all the time. And that doesn't mean necessarily health um, and that, it means going through the the wisdom of pain and grief and what you describe. Um, I was both having um, it felt like a moment of both wisdom and humor when the quote that was told to you by your psychoanalyst who said, "Enjoy your madness." And there was
Mm,
something so wise in that.
mm,
It's linked to what you're saying a little bit for me when you were saying that there's the way we go through life within our culture. Sometimes we miss the that opportunity or blessing, we could say, of this madness. And that progression doesn't mean that we're always in this linear projection. Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
thinking of also like the Jungian, wisdom of the wisdom in the symptom. And I think that a lot of psychoanalysis, at least the Jungian kind, really values the irrational
Yeah.
as having its own wisdom. And I was raised to, in a really rational household and upbringing. And so um, my connection to spirituality, which is irrational. Spirituality is irrationality. It's madness. I don't, how do we define madness? I would say it's a break from reason and rationality. And that's why so many people, including Jung, would call what he was going through a divine madness. It's getting in touch with the divine, and that can come with energy that's chaotic or painful. All of the mystics have talked about that.
Mm,
But to not see like the power and beauty and significance of that for what it is, I think is what the West has done a disservice of. Um, and science, yeah, uh,
mhm,
a lot of, the famous scientists have talked about their scientific revelations coming from states of madness, creative
mhm,
madness, or divinity. And I think, how do we reintegrate the wisdom of the irrational or the divine back into how we view health?
Mhm.
Because I think of sanity, I think of health as not being attached to like contentment or happiness, but being attached to truth. I always think sanity depends on truth,
mm,
and there's so many avenues to get to truth, and the irrational is an important one. Yeah.
mhm. Yeah, if I go back to that parable and then also link it with your the abstract for this piece, one line from your abstract is to honor the universal wisdom that may be arising in these altered states or these extreme states of mental emotional distress or and I wrote in the margins like, wow, I mean, what, there's a lot in this piece that if we slow down and really, it's not always so it's I wrote no small matter, like to be able to actually honor the universal wisdom that's arising in an altered state. And I think there's cultural reasons, and but then also maybe within our own human makeup that like if the parable is one person, let's say, then that means that there's a an aspect of them that's having a quick reaction to these different crises. And then maybe each one of those is demanding certain behaviors, and then you have the maybe. Um, and if I could, I know we'll have it pop up on the screen, but you have so you have these six stages, and I know you created a tarot deck, and then in this article you're focusing on kind of six of them.
I
Um,
only created 6 cards actually.
oh, you
So,
only created six.
yeah.
Okay. Okay, got it. Um, so we have death, the violent initiation, the Four of Swords, mystical dissociation, the Tower, sacred rage, the Devil, shadow integration, the Eight of Cups, self-realization, and the Lovers, agape love. I would like to, if I could, I want to read what you had next to this great image for the devil, the shadow integration. And then I do think I have maybe a decently formulated question, but um, so you wrote, it's painful to peer in the mirror and glimpse the destruction you too are capable of when your ego calls the shots. For that which exists outside of you also exists within you. Um, I'm going to say me because it's directed to me. The sharp edges of others that disturb and enrage me find the courage to face those very demons within. Sometimes my rage is indeed in vain. Sometimes I fail to act in alignment with my cherished values. Sometimes I'm the opposite of who I claim to be, because I am simply human, my dear. Sit with the complex, contradictory spectrum of my own humanity. Observe the shadows that hide inside, right beside my light. Understand this duality as what it means to be human. And don't forget to breathe. I am not a monster. I am simply human. Just breathe. Very powerful. I guess a question I have, and it may not be the right question, but is when you look at kind of the public sphere, let's say, or the US, let's say, do you see anyone who's doing their own kind of shadow work publicly, or do you see opportunities for us as kind of a collective? Is there like a collective shadow work that can be done? Is there any way to kind of um, bring that out more into the open in terms of that? Because I feel like in some senses I certainly could do more of that, and I feel like the general US milieu, we could do more of that somehow, but
Yeah, and that goes to your question a few minutes ago. Yeah, I think that
yeah.
you're really interested in the shadow aspect of this journey. And this is actually kind of what I meant with my joke at the beginning of this conversation about humans being hot messes. But I actually mean that in an endearing way. Uh, I've been talking to Chris about this, but Sophie, so I've been obsessed with like AI. I'm the one, depth psychologist that's completely obsessed with ChatGPT and AI. Um,
Mhm.
for health purposes, it's been kind of supporting me a lot through a health journey and giving it diagnosed me better than any of my human doctors could, accurately, which is fascinating. But then I'm like also then acclimating to the land of humans and being like, hey, what are humans in light of like having this other species we're creating? And I think what's at the core of our nature is that we are fallible creatures. We don't like to admit that because I think we want to believe humans are superior to kind of everything else, but we are really messy. We make mistakes all the time. We put our foots in our mouths, we project, like we project our subjectivity all over the place, like we think we're giving somebody helpful advice, but we're just talking about ourselves. This is what it means to be human. And I think that this is like, can we relate to this quality of ourselves with more endearment? I
Mm.
think many of us also are raised to believe that there's such a thing called good people and bad people. I think
Yeah.
that, like, ooh, when I finally dismantled that, is when I learned what self-love is, what self-compassion is, when I learned to be more loving to others. I think like shadow work is essential to love. Um,
Mm.
because if we can't do the shadow work in ourselves, we're going to be less able to give grace to mistakes and the fallibility of just being human. And
Mm.
the more we judge ourselves when we don't, meet the standards of what it means to be a good person, the more we're going to judge others in our lives. And so
Mm.
I almost think my like complete like foray into AI, and then I'm just like trying to pull myself out now that I got like a diagnosis I need. I'm like trying to, okay, all right, go back to human contact again. Has actually made me like feel more loving to humans, because we
Mm.
are really messy, and I don't know if we need to be fixed. I don't think we need to fix all our messes because then we wouldn't be human. Um,
Yeah.
we're gonna fuck up a lot. We're gonna make mistakes a lot in our lives. We're going to hurt people. We're going to um, be hypocrites. I don't think we can escape that birthright of our species. I
Yeah.
think maybe central to being human is learning grace and compassion for the human experience, which is our fallibility.
Mm. Mm.
There's something I wanted to share with you, um, and it's coming up for me as Chris was reading this sacred, not this shadow integration and specifically the devil card. Um, and I was, and it's coming up for me in a little bit more in the forefront. I deeply encourage people to go read. We will share those texts that you
Mm.
wrote on these cards. They are so moving that to me they felt like each one like prayers, very, very much so.
Mhm.
And I don't have a question for you. I just want to communicate my deep gratitude of the way you place such messiness with just this exact clarity from the deep subconscious, and it's obvious that there's no judgment about any of the parts that are that make us who we are, that you are putting words on. You're describing very complex things, and each one of the description of the cards feel like prayers. And I feel great reverence in the way you describe that. It's just so moving. Um,
Yeah.
and I, I can't quite move forward without telling you this, that I was really touched by that, coming back to each one of the cards and almost like a hymn, each one, and a song and a prayer. It's touching, deeply moving.
Mm.
Thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that. That means a lot to me. You know, it's hard, I think, as an artist. I imagine you both are artists in your own ways. So you can like my artistic process is quite spiritual. And, you know, the longer I move away from my experience of a spiritual emergency, which was really a state of profound receptivity to something
Mm.
bigger than me. And now I am like very grounded in material reality again. And I am, you know, in all these administrative roles at my university. And I'm like in the executive committee of my HOA, you know, so it's very left brain stuff. And it sometimes I fear
Mhm.
that I've lost um, the connection to that voice, which is the voice of the unconscious or the divine imagination, which is really like, you know, the Jungian active imagination voice, but making those
Mm.
tarot cards and then being like, oh, you know what? I had originally put quotes with each tarot card from somebody else's words. And then I thought I should write these words. And I didn't know if I could. But it just flowed out of me. I didn't, you know, I just did it through handwriting in my journal.
Mm.
Looked at the card and I'd wake up at like 6 in the morning, look at the card and just first thing in the morning,
Mm.
write the messages of each card. And it felt,
Mm.
it brought me back in touch with that divine creative collaborator that's always there. Yeah. With its wisdom. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I do feel like those aren't quite my words. They're coming from
Mm.
somewhere, and I,
Yeah.
you know, was able 6 in the morning, first thing waking up, to kind of receive them again. Yeah.
Yeah, that calls to mind to me another section of this piece when um basically you talk about kind of the visionary artist having, I think, kind of the capacity to be seized by the daimonic, right? Then and um my understanding, from Jung and Rollo May, kind of the difference between the demonic and the daimonic, right? Or I don't know if can you maybe well can you talk a little bit about what you mean by the daimonic, like DAIM, that one. I think you might have been quoting Jung too.
Yeah, you might. I would actually be interested to hear you share the
Yeah,
differentiation between them. Yeah. When I was
yeah.
at the daimonic, I am thinking about the, you know, a higher will seizing control of us and demanding that we surrender to its will, which is kind of how Jung talks about it. But yeah, tell me what that differentiation is that you've read.
Yeah, the differentiation I've read is the demonic kind of comes out of Christian theology and is kind of seen as generally an evil force that can grip us. The daimonic, Daimonic, I think maybe originated with Greek myth, but it's like a creative and potentially destructive, often both, force that yeah, that has creativity and destruction in it and can be productive. And I know in your piece you mentioned Jung described the visionary artist as someone who is seized by the daimonic force of the art making process in order to produce primordial images, arise from deep within the timeless archetypal depths. And then you write a little later, if the artist can endure the crisis they might be in, the spiritual crisis, moral crisis, um, they can fulfill their spiritual calling to become a conduit for transformation of the prevailing attitudes of humanity. And so what I something that comes to me from there is this possibility of opening, and I often think of opening a lot in terms of in life and in terms of their psychotherapy process, like presence as something I'm opening to, not something I'm doing to myself or to the client, something that's there, that it's more about kind of harmonization and but that I'm probably not meant to really be opening to all the time, or I'm not definitely not going to anyway. So, um, but this capacity to potentially be seized by the demonic, and that through in you outline kind of this process for then art making. And I know there's lots of different art forms and um, to helping somehow with the attitudes of humanity. And when I think of reading your piece and looking at this artwork, there is a shift of attitude and orientation for me. Maybe a little more openness, a little more, yeah, a little more presence, and a little bit of a wish to suspend some of my, controlling, ego-y tendencies. Um, So I think of like, attitude can sound like kind of a small word of kind of like we all have an attitude or whatever. But like attitude can be a pretty huge thing because it's kind of like part orientation, part mood. How am I receiving someone else? Attitude has something, I mean, that can be really big. What is my receiving tone with someone else? Um, and yeah, I guess a question I did have for you was, any response to that? And then also, do you see certain prevailing attitudes? I mean, I guess maybe we've already talked about some, but prevailing attitudes that um, visionary art in particular could help transform when you look at kind of the current scene? Um,
Yeah, there's a lot there. And so then a lot came up. And so let's just see if they stitch together into something
yeah,
coherent as a response. The first thing that came up was when you were differentiating between demon and daemon. I was like, oh, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I teach the psychology of creativity every semester. And, the more I've been teaching it, the more it's becoming transpersonal in its theoretical approach. And one thing I say at the beginning of the semester is like, do you believe you're are a creative genius? And then there is this sense of shifting that to, do you believe you have creative genius? And that goes back to the Greeks and the Romans who believed, the word genius comes from like a almost like a guardian angel spirit muse, right? That each person is gifted with. That we are not genius, we have a genius, which is a spiritual entity, which is you could think about as the divine muse, that whispers to us. So are we going to listen to it? You know, how do we open up the channels to listen to it? And so with the students, you know, for those that are spiritual, we go more transpersonal with our language. For those that are secular, we go into intuition, intuition being the channel or the vehicle to open up communication with that muse, with the daemon. Secondly, you're going talking about kind of a shift of attitude. And I think that the parable of the Chinese farmer is also offering a shift of attitude. And it brings me back to kind of my original response. What is it that makes us fully and experientially human is deep curiosity about the unfolding possibilities of life. But then I would add to that a deep desire to co-create those possibilities into existence. I think we have agency of how we greet every unfolding moment of our lives. And I think that our attitude and our perspective are the window to that. So even, you know, a shift in perspective, if I'm dealing with a health issue, I can see it as a barrier to all the plans that I've had, right, to be academically productive, to travel here, to travel there. Oh my God, you know, I see it as a barrier, or I can just do a little shift of perspective, which is a creative act. Shifting our perspective is a profoundly creative act, and see it as an opportunity, as a window, as a message of forced rest and respite against my will in a culture that prizes productivity at all costs, right? So that is we always, I mean, Viktor Frankl talked about this, right? We always have the opportunity to choose our attitude, and I think that is human ingenuity. And so then you're asking, well, how do we greet this moment in time as a society? That's kind of where, you know, what's the creative attitude to take? That's what I hear maybe the deeper question is, or how do we greet that? And I think that's actually where my psychology of creativity class has come to across the semester, because it's such profoundly painful and difficult times. But I remind my students and myself, right, when I'm teaching myself this because I'm just saying things, but I need the wisdom too. They're just coming, it's words coming out of my mouth, but I need to hear them. Is that we have a future that will continue to unfold in front of us. We can't know what that future is. Yeah, we can kind of predict that it's going to keep getting pretty bad for a little bit. Something could happen, things can happen. Also, you know, things will happen, and those things are not going to be just bad. And we all, because, you know, I don't know when each of us are going to die, and I hope for all of us a long life if we want that. But we're going to be living across history for decades, possibly. And so, what kind of world do we want to live in? Destruction and rebirth, right? We're entering a new world. This is Rollo May's call to humanity and the courage to create. Do we have the courage to step up and mold the world to be more just and humane? I find the possibilities of AI exciting. I think that they're opening up profound intelligence, and it's going to radicalize, for instance, healthcare. I find it to be just like the computer, you know, which was invented as a weapon to end World War II, and has its evils and its ways of, you know, furthering creative evolution of our species. And so, can we look at our future from all perspectives and embrace the possibilities that excite us and give ourselves the empowerment and agency to shape those possibilities into existence while holding outcomes lightly? That's the last, right? Because we can't actually ever know. Yeah.
Again, so inspiring to me. to hear you describe these thoughts. And I'm reminded how much when we hear each other, we're so much each other's teachers.
Mm.
And I I'm itching to ask you who has been individuals who have been models and exemplar, because to me, as I feel into what you're saying, I can't help but being taught by you and by being moved and touched. And so I am itching to ask you and to know who are the people who have in the past, who are currently models and exemplar.
Well, the first person I'm going to say is my mom. It's Mother's Day
Mhm.
coming up, and I continue to be amazed by her resilience of everything she's gone through in life. And, when I was young, she just would say like this thing that seems so cliche, which was a bend in the road is not the end of the road.
Mm.
And now I'm like, oh, that's the parable of the Chinese farmer. And
Right.
I tell myself that probably every day. And so, yeah, just as you get older, I think as I get older, I could say all these philosophers, blah, blah, but it's my mom. My mom is, just a profound source of wisdom for me, even though she's very rational and pragmatic and not a philosopher at all. But wisdom comes from life experience. And then
Mhm.
secondly, I would say my mentor from Duquesne, which is where I graduated with my PhD, Will Adams. So Will Adams is, he was my clinical supervisor. He was my dissertation advisor. He was my professor across all 6 years. And now uh, something felt, I would end up after I graduated in 2018 talking to him only like once a year or once every 6 months. And then 3 years ago, he had a bicycle accident, riding his bike in the park with his son, and he fell off the bike and he broke his neck. And he almost died. And my father died that way as well. So my dad, when I was 19, died from a bicycle accident in which he wasn't wearing a helmet. And so the synchronicity also around kind of Will being a surrogate father figure for me and his own,
Mm.
near-death experience, it was really difficult for me. And then I was, he wrote an article and it's called A Wellness Beyond All Wounds: Contemplative Approaches to Trauma Healing. And in it, he describes how he attributes his life being saved by his decades-long meditative practice. And because he had been meditating daily for almost 4 decades, he was able to go through the tremendous pain
Mm.
of his experience through a contemplative sensibility that allowed him to greet each moment with curiosity and equanimity. And he attributes that to saving his life, and he's so great now. I mean, his health is so great now. And so, anyway, about a year ago, I was meditating after kind of going through after I've been dealing with long COVID. And so, after that, I was meditating, and he just kept popping up in my mind. And I was like, Will, I need you to be my teacher again. Like I have to be taught by you. And so I've been meditating with him in a group that he leads virtually every Friday morning. And it's like such a commitment. I think he's one of the wisest people I've ever met. His life is just filled with resiliency and curiosity and deep love. Like he's one of the most loving people I know. And I'm just so grateful. Like I just am filled with gratitude, to be able to be in the presence of such loving people, including my mom and Will. Yeah.
Mm.
Mm.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you.
asking that. Yeah.
Mm. There's a lot to sit with here. I know I want to be respectful of time because I believe we said an hour and it's been an hour. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to connect with us about all this. And there's certainly, I mean, I have way more notes. There's a lot that wasn't asked, but we'll have to wait, and not everything can be completed in that sense. And yeah, is there any closing thoughts that anybody has as we kind of wrap up?
I don't have any thoughts. I'd like to see what maybe you'd like to part us with, Nisha.
Yeah.
I think that I'd love to part ways with both of you by sharing that I think the number one experience in a felt way that I've been having since my spiritual emergency is gratitude. Um,
Mm.
I like, I just find myself profoundly moved all the time by experiences that I am receiving as a gift. And this is one of them. So this is such a gift. I haven't had the chance to talk about my spiritual emergency paper so much. So the Division 32 conference was my first time talking about it, and this is the second time talking about it. Um, and it, so just know how much it means to me and how I'm experiencing this as a rare gift. And I thank you both for creating this time and taking my soul and my experience and our collective experience seriously for this. Yeah.